In Plato's Meno, we see Socrates in a conversation, in a dialogue with Meno, and the topic of the conversation is virtue. In particular, we see Meno presenting to Socrates this question, whether virtue can be taught. He says, "Can you tell me, Socrates, can virtue be taught?" And so Socrates' response to this is, "I am so far from knowing whether virtue can be taught or not that I do not even have any knowledge of what virtue itself is." So with this issue of whether virtue can be taught, this was an important issue at the time, more so than it is today. It should be an important issue today, but in general, people don't talk about virtue that much today. But in the days of Socrates, this was an important issue. Whether virtue can be taught or whether somebody's just born with it. And so when confronted with this question, Socrates says, "I don't even know what virtue is. How can I respond and tell you whether it can be taught or not?" Now, this is a very important point that Socrates is making here. He is pointing out that he does not know what it is. When you are asking what something is, or you don't know what something is, you are talking about definition. You want a definition of the thing. So this is the first stage in logic, is definition. You must have, or you must be on the same terms with your opponent in order to proceed any further. In other words, you must have some sort of an agreement on what the terms mean in the propositions in order to start talking about whether the proposition is true or false. In other words, the proposition of whether virtue can be taught, if we put that in propositional form and we said virtue can be taught, that's a proposition. Okay? Virtue can be taught. Here's another proposition. Virtue cannot be taught. Okay? So before we start deciding whether those statements are true or false, we have to agree on what virtue is. If we don't agree on what virtue is, how are we going to know the truth or falsity of those statements? So you must come to terms with the opponent or with the person you're arguing with. And this is what Socrates points out here. This is why he says, "I don't even know what virtue is." So that's what we need to talk about, what virtue is. In other words, Socrates is going to want a definition of virtue. So he says in this last line here, "But Meno, by the gods, what do you yourself say that virtue is?" So Meno is the one who gave the proposition. He's the one who asked the question, in other words. In other words, he didn't give the proposition, he gave the issue. Okay? But he wants a proposition in return. Okay? So he gave the issue of whether virtue can be taught. Can it be taught or not? And he wants Socrates to respond with an answer, right? With the proposition. But Socrates doesn't do that because he recognizes, wait, we don't even know what virtue is. I don't know what virtue is. Maybe you can tell me. If you can tell me what virtue is, then I could tell you whether or not it could be taught or not. So Socrates asks Meno, what is virtue? What's the definition? And so Meno is going to try to give a definition. And so here he goes. He says, "First, if you want the virtue of a man, it is easy to say that a man's virtue consists of being able to manage public affairs. If you want the virtue of a woman, it is not difficult to describe. She must manage the home well. The virtue of a child, whether male or female, is different again. And there are very many other virtues." Yeah, it's not difficult to define and give definitions like this, like the ones Meno is giving right here. These are easy to give. The reason they're easy to give because they're just examples. So if somebody wants a definition of a table, that's easy to give. Just point at a table. Somebody wants a definition of a shark, well, that's easy. Go to a book with a shark in it and point to it. There's a shark right there. You want the definition, anything, you can define anything in this way very easily. Right? These aren't hard to give at all. We need examples like this. We need definitions like this. We need examples of things. But this is not the type of definition that Socrates is looking for. Socrates wants the essential definition. One of the elements of the Socratic method is that Socrates is searching for an essential definition. What's an essential definition? It's the best definition. It is the definition that includes all the instances of that thing you are defining. So Meno fails at his first attempt when he gives a definition by example. And so Socrates is going to try to help Meno. And so he's trying to explain to him how he failed and why he failed. And so Socrates brings up the notion of bees. He says, "Tell me, what is this very thing, Meno, in which they are all the same and do not differ from one another?" What is that element? So in other words, Meno gave a definition by example, and he gave a bunch of examples. Okay, a bunch of examples. Socrates wants to know, okay, you gave me a lot of different examples of virtue, but how are they all the same? Because you gave me a bunch of examples. What characteristic links them together? This is why he brings up this notion of bees. Bees are many. There are many types of bees. Look at that picture right there on the right. Look at all those bees right there. There's more than that in the world. There's thousands, millions of bees. And they're all different. So in other words, if you ask me what a bee is, I could just point to one of those. Hey, here's a bee right here. I can point to ones of different size, different color. These are examples of bees. But what is it that makes all bees a bee? What is it that makes all bees one? There are many bees, but there has to be some characteristic by which we call them bees. This is Socrates searching for the form. He wants to know what the form of a bee is. And so when he's talking about bees, he's using this as an analogy to virtues. There are many virtues, but what are the characteristics what characteristic do they share in common by which we call them virtue? In other words, by which they are one. So we see here Socrates explaining this. The same is true in the case of virtues. Even if they are many and various, all of them have one and the same form, which makes them virtues. In other words, all of them have one and the same nature, which makes them virtues. That's what Socrates is looking for, and that is not easy to give. Okay, so Meno answered right away what the definition of bees are, and with examples, which is very easy to do. But telling the form of something, telling the nature of something, telling the essence of something is very difficult to do. Because when you tell the form of something, you're giving the essential definition. In other words, you are giving those characteristics that apply to every instance of the thing you're defining. And it does not include things that you're not defining. So if you were going to give the form or the essential definition of a chair, it would only include chairs and it would not include tables. Now that can be difficult to do, but that is the beginning of real knowledge right there, because essential definitions are principles by which you build other arguments and other knowledge upon. So here we see, and look at these pictures right here. We have, these are instances, we can say, of virtue. Look at, they're various. Look at the one on the left where somebody's drowning, and then let's say that somebody's trying to help them. Somebody's trying to save somebody from drowning. And so they offer him a device, but what if that drowning person pulls the person in that's trying to save him? So we can say that that is an instance of courage right there. And courage is a virtue. All right. And then we have another picture right there with the fireman. It looks like he's holding a little baby. So that is another instance of courage. But those are two separate examples. Two examples of courage. This is similar to the definition that Meno gave. I'm just giving you examples right now. And now look at the third one right there on the right. We see that somebody is maybe at a food bank and they're handing out food, doing charity. Charity is also a virtue. But this is a different example of virtue. But listen, look at all these three pictures. We call all of these acts virtue. All right, but they are different examples of virtue. But what is it that makes all of these examples virtuous? What makes them all one? In other words, that can be confusing when I say that, because this topic, this issue, hits at one of a main problem in philosophy called the one and the many. Okay, things are many, like right here, these pictures. There are many instances of virtue, but they are all one in some sense because we call them all virtues. Okay, so there are many examples, many instances, but they are all united. United in what way? They are united by their essence. Okay, the essence. This is what Socrates is trying to explain to us here. Is that when we say and we give examples of something, but we call them all the same name, or they represent the same type of thing, like bees. So there are many bees, but we call them all bees, and they are under the banner of being a bee. What is it? What characteristic, what is the essence of a bee that unites the many bees? I'm not going to give you an answer to that right now because we're just on the search for it. And I got news for you. Meno is not going to give an answer either. But the important point here is what Socrates is looking for. Well, the important point here is the standard of Socrates. Socrates knows that if you're really going to know something and you want to give full knowledge of something, you must give the essence of it. You must give the essential definition. You must tell that characteristic that unites all those many examples as one. So we see here that Meno is going to give a second definition. And the second definition is because he fails in the first one, definition by example. That is not an essential definition. Although they are useful, that is not what Socrates is looking for. So here's his second definition. Virtue is to be able to secure good things with justice. Virtue is to be able to secure good things with justice. So Meno arrives at this second definition through much conversation and back and forth with Socrates, and actually maybe a little even some help from Socrates in the question and answer. And so let's think about this definition. Virtue is to be able to secure good things with justice. Now, the problem with this definition is that justice is a virtue. Justice is a virtue. But we are supposed to be defining what a virtue is. When you are defining something and when you're trying to give an essential definition, you cannot give an example of the thing you're trying to define in the definition. So we see here that Meno is giving a definition of virtue that involves justice. Justice is a virtue. This type of definition is circular, and it involves a fallacious type of reasoning called begging the question. Why is it called begging the question? It's it's best exemplified in the dialogue itself. When Socrates mentions the word begging like 2 or 3 times, he says, I begged you for the definition right now, but now I got to ask you again. Begging the question. Begging means to ask. So what happens when you give a circular definition, you're just repeating yourself. The person has to ask again for the definition because you just went in a circle, right? So Meno was defining virtue with a part of virtue. What's the part of virtue? Justice. So he's defining virtue with the virtue. You see the circular definition going on here? So Socrates says, because when I begged you to tell me about virtue as a whole, you are far from telling me what it is. Then he goes on, then surely, my good sir, you must not think, while the nature of virtue as a whole is still under inquiry, that by answering in terms of the parts of virtue, you can make its nature clear to anyone, or make anything clear by speaking in this way. So you cannot answer in terms of the parts of virtue. That does not make the nature of virtue clear. Why? Because you're answering in terms of its parts. You're supposed to be defining virtue, but you're defining virtue with another virtue, circular. But only that the same question, and then here's what he says at the end, but only that the same question must be put to you again. Begging the question. You're asking, I have to ask you again now. You know, that's what he's saying. I have to ask you again what virtue is. So here we have Meno's paradox. Meno at this point has pretty much given up because he's given some definitions, and Socrates has showed that these definitions are wanting. They're not good enough. They're not the type of definition that Socrates is looking for. They're not the type of definition that tells us the essence of the thing, the essence of what virtue is. And so Meno says at this point, how will you look for it, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? Now, this is a paradox that Meno gives, and a paradox is something that on its face it seems absurd and contradictory, but it could be true. And so this is the beginning of the paradox. How, if you don't know something, how will you know when you find it? So what Socrates is going to do at this point is he is going to restate the argument that Meno is presenting. And this is a good habit to build. And Socrates does this often. When somebody gives you an argument, it is a good practice to restate their argument in your own words so that you have clarification and you could find out if it's really what they meant. So when you're arguing with someone, you restate their argument back, and your opponent can say, yeah, okay, that's what I meant. Or they can say, no, that's not what I mean. You're getting this part wrong. And you want to do that because you want the opponent's real argument. You don't want to be arguing with someone and then your opponent gives you an argument and you understand their argument in your own way and it's not what they meant. And then what you do is you tear that argument down that you have in your head, but it's not their argument. That's called a straw man. When you're arguing with someone and the opponent gives you an argument and you misunderstand it, you don't understand it properly, and you tear that argument down, you counter that argument, what you did is you made a straw man, you made some fake argument in your own mind, and then you tore that down. You didn't deal with the opponent's real argument. This is fallacious reasoning. This is called the straw man fallacy. And so we don't want to commit that fallacy. We want the opponent's actual argument. And that's why it's good to restate the person's argument so that you can find out if that's what they really meant. Now, somebody who's concerned with the truth would do this. Someone who's not concerned with the truth will just take whatever somebody says and then just turn it around, make it a different argument, and tear that down. Someone who's not concerned with the truth would do that fallacy. But someone like Socrates, who's concerned with the truth, They're going to make sure that they really understand what the opponent is saying, what the other person is saying. And they're going to deal with the real argument because they're searching for the truth. And if the person is given an argument that leads to a true conclusion, you want to know that. Okay, so Socrates, he's going to restate the opponent's argument, and oftentimes Socrates will restate the opponent's argument in a better way than how they stated it. And that's what he does here with Meno's paradox, with this issue and these propositions that Meno brings up. Socrates says, "Do you realize what a debater's argument you are bringing up?" Socrates has heard of this argument before. I mean, doesn't it seem that way when he says, "What a debater's argument you are bringing up"? In other words, Socrates has heard this argument, this debater's argument. This is not new to Socrates. And then Socrates says that a man cannot search for what he knows or for what he does not know. So we see that Socrates is fleshing this argument out. This is also a good habit, to strengthen or to complete the opponent's argument if they have not done so. That is not a fallacy. That's actually a good thing. If somebody gives you an argument and you see that they didn't give the full argument, or they didn't give the argument in its strongest form, you can fill that in for them. That's actually a good thing. That helps towards finding the truth of the matter. And that's what Socrates does here. So Socrates has presented both horns of this dilemma. The first one being that if you don't know something, how are you going to know when you find it? Remember, they're talking about virtue here. They're on the search for the essential definition of virtue. And Meno's given some definitions, and both of them are wanting. Both of them are not sufficient. And so Meno kind of throws his hands up in the air and says, listen, if we don't know what it is, how are we going to know when we find it? And then the next part of it is that if you already know it, then why are you looking for it? That's why Socrates says either for what he knows or for what he does not know. Okay? If you already know something, would you look for it? If you already know who your brother is, would you look for him? If you already know how to solve a math problem, would you look it up? No, you wouldn't.